Welcome to the creative community. I'm your host, David Starkey, and my guest this time is Santa Barbara Independent culture editor, Leslie Dinaberg. Leslie, welcome.
Hi, David.
Great to have you back on the show here in Creative Community 2.0. We got a lot of sort of recent stuff to look at, things that you've been doing, and you know, as I often tell you, you're one of the few people I know who's made their actual living from writing. So you're kind of like a goddess to me. But I'd like to talk first about, like, how did you get into that? I mean, were you that little kid who was making their own magazines and newspapers, or when did you realize that you were someone who had a facility with words that you could, you know, monetize, basically?
I definitely have always loved to read. Like, if you talk to people that knew me when I was, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8 years old, they would describe me as being the kid in the corner reading.
Right.
And I would say I was always interested in being some sort of a writer, and very interested actually in being a journalist from the time I was young. But didn't really become a journalist until I worked in marketing for a while.
Okay.
So it was a little bit of a back end
Right.
way to do that.
Were you doing?
I worked for a theme park design company.
Oh.
Yeah, so, you know, very specialized. And at the time, there were a lot of business magazines that were writing about that business, and so those were kind of the first professional stories I wrote. And then after my son was born and we moved back into Santa Barbara, I got a job with a marketing magazine that was in Santa Barbara.
Right.
So that was kind of how I broke into the business.
Right.
So a little bit differently than a lot of people have.
But you've been in this business in our pretty small town
Yeah.
for a long time, always finding the newest thing. I mean, obviously you have this great credentials and a lot of experience, but that's got to be a little touch and go sometimes, I imagine.
I definitely sometimes feel like I'm the last journalist. But, you know, I've always worked as a writer and an editor, first of all, which I think has helped a lot, is, you know, having both of those skill sets and doing both of those things.
So you're kind of editing your own work even as yours.
And other people's too.
Right.
Yeah. And you know, I'm definitely not a specialist. And so I think that's another thing that sort of enabled me to work in a lot of different places, is I feel like I know a little bit about a lot of things, as opposed to, you know, there's a lot of people that know a lot about certain things. Yeah.
And I think that's true. I know that you've you know, written about, well, you could tell me all the different strange and wonderful things that you've written about. But I think of you also as a great fit for the culture editor for the Independent, because before you did that, you had a long-time gig with Santa Barbara Seasons.
Exactly.
And that was, there was a lot of art stuff involved, right? I mean, design, food, in addition to, you know, all the other things that you covered.
Yeah, no, we covered all kinds of arts and culture for Seasons. And what was really fun about that was it really was a big variety of things. You know, I've always been interested in architecture, for example, and that was a big part of our coverage. But, you know, the interesting thing about that is, you know, over the years, I covered a lot of things that were going to be happening as previews, but we never ever almost got to cover things as they were actually happen and report on them. You know, so I'd report about the whole bowl season, for example, or the
Before
whole
the bowl
arts and lecture
started,
season,
yeah.
Or the film festival.
Right.
But then we'd get to do very little about it as it was happening
Right,
or
right.
after it was happening.
Because you were a quarterly magazine, right? You
Exactly,
were coming out
exactly.
as The Independent does every day now, basically.
Yeah, pretty
online.
much, yeah.
Right.
So it's been really fun. And, you know, in some ways it's learning a new thing. You know, like writing reviews, for example. I hadn't really ever written reviews, so you know, that was definitely a little bit of a learning curve for me, even though I'd written tons and tons of previews over the years. So yeah, it's a lot of it is very familiar territory, but not always from the same angle.
Well, you've brought in a number of images for us to look at, and they're not necessarily arranged in a logical or chronological order, which is going to be great because that's all about the arts. You know, it's an art show. So let's sort of bring them up one by one and let you sort of talk about what it is that we're looking at. So what's this?
Okay, so this is a recent cover of the Santa Barbara Independent. This is Charlie Crockett, who was the season opener for Arts and Lectures this year in the beginning of October. And one of the reasons I included this was because, number one, I just love the image.
Yeah, great picture.
But also, you know, this was part of a whole sort of fall preview for some of the arts that were coming. And, you know, one of the things that's been so exciting for me at the Independent is, you know, I've worked with them as a writer and a contributor for several years, but I've only been on staff since the spring. And I just was lucky enough to kind of come on staff as things were really, really getting back after the pandemic.
Right.
So it's been, you know, going from not very many things happening culturally in Santa Barbara to, you know, more than ever before. So, you know, it was really fun to be able to have an actual kind of arts preview with a whole bunch of stuff to write about. I mean, way, way, way more than we were ever able to include. Yeah.
What was that pandemic period like for you? I mean, as a person, but also as a writer. You just mentioned there wasn't a lot to cover. I mean, what were you doing as a writer at that point?
Well, when the pandemic started, I was actually working as the editor-in-chief for Touring and Tasting Magazine, which was a wine and travel magazine, which was, you know, an incredibly fun job. And, you know, unfortunately that shut down. I mean, not only did it shut down, but, you know, our anniversary issue that we did could barely get distributed because most of the places that it was distributed were tasting rooms and hotels that were closed. So, you know, that was definitely heartbreaking and that particular avenue of writing really did shut down for quite a while. And I had, you know, at that point I was writing for the Independent, so I was still doing some freelance stuff for them. I was working as an editor for a bunch of different sort of one-off projects. I had been doing some writing for UC Santa Barbara and actually worked on a new magazine for them, a new alumni magazine. So, you know, I was fortunate to be able to sort of pivot a little bit after I had pivoted in the first place when seasons closed. But yeah, it's been a rocky few years for sure.
Well, I'm curious, again, as someone who makes their living writing, are these things like kind of dropping in your lap? Or are you actively going out and looking for everything? How does that sort of combination of gigs like manifest itself in your working life?
I've been really fortunate. I am not that great at marketing myself. And most of the work I would say that I've gotten has been through people I have worked with before or that I know or kind of referrals. You know, I will pitch stories for sure, but I mostly would pitch a story to an editor that I already had a relationship with as opposed to, there are some people that are really good about, I want to write about this, and they'll go do their research and figure out, what kind of publications might be interested in that. And I haven't typically been super great about that. So luckily, Santa Barbara is a very friendly pond as far as that goes. I think people are pretty good about trying to help each other out and refer people to other things. And it's really interesting. I think, it's one of those rains that pours things. It took a while to find a full-time permanent position. And once I took one, I had multiple job offers from other places just sort of calling me out of the blue. And it's like, well, where were you 6 months ago or whatever? But I feel like I really landed in a place that's a really good fit. So I'm very happy how things worked out. And it's been a great experience.
That environment that you're talking about, that was one of the inspirations for the name, the creative community, almost 20 years ago when we started the show, is just the sense that it's a group of people sort of who have each other's backs.
Yeah.
Not always, but.
Yeah, well, and I think if people do a good job, you appreciate that.
Right.
And, I try to do the same too. I mean, I definitely, there's writers I work with over and over again that I've worked with at multiple places. And there's, people that I edit for that, have moved to different places that keep hiring me. I do think once you know somebody is dependable, first of all, and then enjoy working with them, it's nice to be able to sort of stick to some of the same people.
Right.
Which isn't to say that I'm not open to working with different people too, because I definitely am. But,
okay. Well, let's take a look at our next image.
Okay, see what
we don't know
remember what else I got. Okay.
What's this?
This is also another cover, another recent cover of The Independent, and this is one I was actually really proud of. So, New Beginnings brought in this show called Every Brilliant Thing as a fundraiser, and New Beginnings provides all kinds of different mental health services to the community. They're an amazing organization. They've been around for a long time, but one of their strategies in the last few years has been to raise awareness and raise money through the arts. And so I thought that was a really interesting idea, not just that they were doing this particular fundraiser. And so we actually did kind of a package of stories that were related to the arts and activism and awareness, using this play, Every Brilliant Thing, as kind of a news peg, because it was something that was actually happening in our community. And that's one of the things that I feel like having had a background in sort of community news and writing a lot about nonprofits and also writing about the arts, I can look at that in a different way that maybe somebody who's always been an arts editor might not look at that.
Right. And we just had that image of the UC Santa Barbara Magazine, which is a good example of you working in that different area.
Yeah. So that was a really nice package of stories. And then the other thing that's kind of cool about that is The Independent has, there's a Mickey Flax Journalism Fund for Social Justice that's done in her honor. And so they actually paid for part of that package too, which was a nice thing as well. So
let's see what we have next on.
Okay.
There it is.
Oh yeah, so this is the UC Santa Barbara magazine, this was the first issue. So basically, they had an old alumni magazine, and when the person that had been doing that for years and years retired, they sort of rejiggered that product, and this is what we did.
You got something a little bit splashier.
Yeah, exactly. And so, like, here's arts and lectures. So there's a lot of things that I would say I've been sort of interested in and writing about and covering from a lot of different perspectives for years and years and years. So, like, for example, that's a Jane Gottlieb art piece that's in the library at UC Santa Barbara, which coincidentally, I didn't even realize this at the time, my brother-in-law's business they do large-scale printing, and
he
printing
printed
pros,
it,
and he
yeah?
printed it, yes, and helped install it. So, it's kind of a funny coincidence. But, so she's an artist, for example, that we covered multiple times in seasons. I've been to her house and done a story about that. She's a really interesting woman. I'm a fan of her work. Here she is at UCSB, and we actually have something in the works with her at the Independent right now, too.
Ah, cool.
So, there are sort of people and things that that keep popping up in different capacities, which is, the nice thing about being in a small community like Santa Barbara is you're able to do that.
So as a culture editor, I mean, what are you mentioned Jane, who are the artists? What's the sort of art that gets you excited?
I tend to like contemporary art and appreciate, I like living artists. I like artists that you could talk to about what they're doing.
Right,
Although,
right.
I obviously certainly appreciate
Some of
some of the other stuff too. But, in terms of coverage, I would say I'm honestly much more interested in showing like the breadth and the depth of what we have in Santa Barbara than I am in showing any particular kind of art or music or dance or whatever. I really think it's important to kind of try to show as much as we can. Yeah.
Is there anything, I mean, I don't know, but you can answer this. Is there anything you really don't like?
I mean, there's things that I like more than other things.
Right.
I think I like to be able to appreciate something aesthetically and then learn more about it. So I don't feel like you should have to work too hard to be able to appreciate something, at least on a surface level. So I would say that's one of my preferences.
Now, as we've been talking, the images have been streaming by.
Yeah.
So what are we looking at here?
So I think this is actually a food story that I wrote for 805 Living. Yeah, it is. And these are really fun. I did a number of these when I was freelancing. Lynn at 805 Living is a great editor, and she's lovely to work with. And she really was like the day that seasons closed that I found out, we had a dinner, like a press dinner at the Biltmore, and she offered me work that night.
Oh,
so,
wow.
it's like she's been really
She offered
lovely.
you that gig that...
Not necessarily that particular
Yeah?
story, but,
Right.
she was like, I've got a story for you, just let me know if you want to do some freelancing. It was really very gracious.
Because I remember thinking, oh, poor Leslie, she
Yeah.
lost this gig, but that
Yeah.
same night you had another one, yeah.
Well, but I mean, it was, just
wasn't
a
quite as-
project.
yeah, right,
but
right.
yeah. And so these are visitor magazines that I've worked just as a copy editor for, which is something that I do, kind of a side job, which has been really a nice project.
Now, we were talking about seasons. Here's one
Here's
of the covers.
seasons. Here's one of the covers. So, for example, that is a fashion shoot that was shot at Lotus Land, which I really love Lotus Land. And so, I've written about Lotus Land and worked with Lotus Land
Whatever
in
opportunity you can get on the property.
many different capacities. Yeah. So, it's kind of fun to see things that, keep popping up in different ways over and over again. These are just some of my favorite seasons covers. The film festival is another example of something that I'm really excited for this year.
You're gonna be covering it live.
I can finally
Go
cover
watch the
it.
movies.
I mean, I've always had a press pass and had access, for the last probably 15 years or so. But this year I actually get to really, really cover it and really, dig into the films. And, Roger and I have worked together with him as a writer.
Right.
He's also interviewed me. So, we've gone kind of back and forth. And I've been covering Cinema Society the last couple of months. I'm really excited for that. Here's another cover that I really love. I think this is the last issue of Seasons that was actually published. So,
Well, there was another one in the works, right?
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A love letter
somewhere
to
on,
Fiesta.
yeah. So this was a really fun story. This is Cammie Barnwell, and that's actually her daughter. And then Timo Nunez took the photo, and he's also a flamenco dancer, and that's him. So that's their reflection.
I love that. It's a great picture. Yeah.
You know, that's been really fun. You know, covers are always one of my favorite things, and you know, with seasons we didn't get very many covers, and with the Independent we have so many covers, so that's really nice.
Do you have much input on the covers?
On all the art stories and the stories I write, I do. Yeah.
Are you assigning the photographer and telling them sort of this is what I'm thinking?
So all the editors handle the photography. So this is another recent one that I was really happy with. So for the active aging, I've written this section several times, and it's always been, up until this year, sort of an advertiser suggested section where, you know, the advertisers will pitch you stories, and then they don't have editorial input, but they determine a lot of, the content.
Yeah.
And this year we didn't do it that way. This year I just, I determined the content. And it was really
Did you still get
fun.
the advertisers to come in?
Yeah. Oh yeah. No, I think it gets better readership when the stories are more interesting. It's just, it takes more time too. Yeah.
Well, there's that sense sometimes when you're reading a story that this is true, this is semi-interesting, but it's also an advertisement.
Yeah, you can tell.
Yeah,
exactly. You can tell.
So what we just have about like 8 minutes left, and we've sort of looked through a lot of stuff. I'm really curious to know like what it is that you want to do. This, that's a big job as a culture editor for the Independent. What would you like to? How would you like to change things, or what would you like to emphasize, or what's the future like?
I'm excited. I mean, I feel like there's all kinds of great things that I know about that I'm looking forward to covering. I would also, you and I have talked about this. I'd like us to be able to do more book coverage. That's one of my goals for sure. I have some really good young arts writers that are interns that I'm working with right now, and so I'm hoping to bring in, some younger sensibilities, particularly about music and what's going on in that area. And then also, I think things that overlap culturally with other areas of the community. So covering, nonprofits, for example, and, how they decide what their fundraising is and how that relates to particularly the arts nonprofits. But there's other nonprofits, other types of nonprofits that, bring in different cultural entities to how they do their work and involve it too. So I think, trying to look at things a little more holistically when we can. It's interesting working at a place with such defined departments. Okay. Because
you're the culture department.
Yeah. So there's often things that come in and, Tyler Hayden is our life editor, and life is kind of...
That's a pretty big
It's
umbrella.
kind of the catch-all for everything that, doesn't fit into news, food, and wine and culture. And so because of that, there's a lot of really interesting things that we don't always necessarily know how we're going to cover it. And so I'm definitely interested in trying to sort of broaden that that bucket and try to, cover as much of the community as we can.
Right. I'm curious, you mentioned earlier that like writing reviews was kind of a new thing to you. So what's a recent review that you wrote that was maybe like not only fun, but kind of challenging, especially if, it's sort of a new genre for you?
Well, one of my first reviews I did for the Independent was opera Santa Barbara, which was hilarious.
You're not a big
I'm
opera.
really not an opera buff. But it was really enjoyable, and I decided to just approach it as a reporter as opposed to a
like the
critic.
E flat on the spar or whatever.
But I loved doing all the bowl shows, or not all the bowl shows, but all the bowl shows I did this summer I really loved. I'm looking forward to the dance series from Arts and Lectures. But it's also, and I've had a lot of conversations with Joe Woodard about this, kind of learning how to both be able to absorb and enjoy something, but then still kind of take notes and document it while you're experiencing it.
Yeah.
And there's been a few things that I've gone to since I started writing, reviews that were things that I bought tickets for in advance that I just went to as an audience member. And in some ways, I think you almost appreciate that more when it's like, I don't even have to think about if I like this or what I think about this or what they're doing. I can just have the experience.
I feel that way reading a book rather than having to
exactly,
review it. Yeah.
Exactly.
It's like, this is fun and I don't have to take notes,
Yeah, but at the same time, there's also the thing where, I saw recently the movie Don't Worry, Darling.
Oh, did you?
And I wasn't planning on reviewing it, but I had so much that I thought about it, that I was thinking about it, that I actually did write a review afterward because, I can do that. And I had something to say.
Yeah.
And,
what did you think of the movie? I've heard a lot about it, but I haven't seen it.
I think it's worth seeing. I thought Florence Pugh was fabulous.
Right.
There's a lot of really good elements in it, and I didn't think it quite worked. I love looking at Harry Styles, and I appreciate how much people appreciate him, but I think he wasn't quite up to the rest of the cast, in my view.
Right.
And it's hard to disappear into a part when you're one of the most famous people in the world. So I think that's an issue too.
Good point.
So
in our last couple minutes, so someone's out there and they're like, oh, I want to do what Leslie Dinaberg does. Is there anything that you could say again in just 2 minutes that would sort of sum up like some quick but sort of smart moves that people could make?
I would say absorb as much culture as you can, and then read as much as you can about other people's arts writing, and read it and think about it too. Like, don't just read it, but read it a few times and sort of recognize, they're writing this from third person, or they're writing this in first person, and it's only this long, but this person writes, and it has a very nice flow to their writing, or this is a little more staccato, or just sort of observing how other people write, and then kind of developing your own style is really important.
Is there a arts writer that you just totally love?
I actually think our own Joe Woodard is an excellent writer. I think Nick Welsh, who's actually written a couple art stories for us recently, is a fabulous writer. He's also, I've hired him over the years for various things. He's one of the hardest people I've ever had to edit, because everything flows, every sentence flows into the next one. So it's not like, I can just get rid of this paragraph and we'll be fine.
Suddenly there's
and I don't know if that's intentional or not, but that's, I think, a sign of really good writing in many ways. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's, been a great pleasure to talk to you. I mean, I will talk to you periodically in a restaurant or a house or whatever, and I always feel like you're a deferential listener too. Like when there's a conversation going, I know you were saying earlier that you're, a vigorous speaker, but I think you are also a great listener, which is something that makes for a great interviewer and a great writer.
Oh,
so
that's very kind.
Leslie Dinaberg, thank you so very much for being on the Creative Community. I really appreciate it.
Thanks, David.
The Creative Community is produced with a generous grant from the Diana and Simon Robb Foundation and broadcast on TVSB in Santa Barbara and CAPS TV in Ventura. I'm David Starkey, and we'll see you next time.